Hello there. You're watching All 24 News special coverage on the Zionist aggression against Palestine. What's on the latest now, the Zionist army killed at least 3 Palestinians, including the wanted activist Ibrahim al-Nabulsi, after the occupation forces stormed the old city of Nablus in the northern West Bank, coinciding with armed clashes that resulted in the injuries of several Palestinians. The occupation army said that it used a shoulder-fired missile while shooting at Nabulsi, which led to his death along with another person. In the reaction of the Palestinian groups, the Hamas spokesman said that it is clear that they are in a new phase of the struggle against the occupation, entitled The Continuous Clash in the Cities of the West Bank. The Fatah movement also mourned the martyrs of Nablus and said that the assassination crime will only increase their determination to continue the confrontation with the occupation. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestinians mourned the martyrs Nablus, stressing that the blood of the martyrs will not be in vain. And to analyze further the situation, I am talking with Muti' Musbah, Palestinian activist from Gaza, as well as Hania Al-Jamal, also an activist from Gaza, along with Mark Lowe, an expert on international relations from Italy. Gentlemen, madam, thank you for joining us. The show right after this. Hello again, I'm your host, Karim Faz-Zakari. Let's bring in the latest. The Zionist occupation forces stormed the old city of Nablus and killed 3 leaders of Alqsa Martyrs brigades. 2 of the leaders were targeted during a special operation launched by the Zionist occupation forces after besieging a residential house in the eastern neighborhood of the old city of Nablus. For its part, the Palestinian Ministry of Health said that the death toll in the West Bank and Gaza Strip has risen to 126 since the beginning of this year. So let's kick it off with you, Mr. Muti'. How do you read the targeting and the assassination of the leaders of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades of the Fatah movement in this way in Nablus today by the Zionist occupation, and why this time and place in particular?
Yes, first of all, thank you. Thanks for having me. Actually, no one can deny that this aggression comes in the context of the ongoing and the continuous terrorism and aggression attack or practiced by the Israeli occupation. And actually, it gives and it presents more concrete evidence that Israel doesn't understand any language but the language of force and the resistance. This actually presents more evidence that Israel even doesn't differentiate between the Palestinian and the other Palestinian, whether the Palestinians was from Fatah, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad. The Israeli occupation doesn't differentiate between any Palestinians or Palestinian people across all Palestinian territories are under the Israeli brutality and under the Israeli attacks. So we are in front of another round of the Israeli brutality and the Israeli terrorism. The Palestinians here in Gaza are still mourning their martyrs, are still suffering and embracing the pain of their beloved ones whom they lost under the Israeli airstrikes. But Israel insists on committing its crimes against the Palestinian people without any consideration to the international legislations or law, or without any or laws, or without having any respect for the Palestinians' human rights. So this is the context with this regard.
Very nice indeed. And Ms. Hania, what is the goal of the Zionist occupation of simultaneous escalation in several Palestinian areas and opening a comprehensive confrontation with the Palestinian people? What are the consequences of that, and what message, according to you, do you think it carries to convey to the world? And is the escalation linked to, let's say, the electoral campaign or electoral agendas taking place in occupying Israel?
Well, allow me to start by saying that more than once it does not come as a coincidence that most of the escalations over Gaza and in other various areas in Palestine conveniently come at the time of elections as a walking, their electoral campaign of such that carries the message or provides the goal of the Zionist movement, that is to eradicate as much Palestinians as possible and to take over as much land as it can. Now, with that being said, having these, carrying on the destruction in various areas and is basically a message to the Palestinian people that they are not welcomed in their own town. It's a proof to the fact that the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation and the settlers' approach to the Palestinian people who have been in the land is one of complete disacceptance and a message of a way of discouraging Palestinians to carry on living in the land that they have been living in for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically making life as unbearable as can possibly be.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. Let's bring in Mr. Mark Lowe here to the discussion. After the truce started between the occupying entity and the Islamic Jihad movement, the Israeli occupier moved to another area targeting Palestinians. Do you think this would have the same consequences against Palestinians, mainly civilians? And how would the resistance group react against these killings?
I think we can perhaps turn the question around a little bit. I think that it's very, very obvious that any militant or resistance group will respond in a violent fashion to any form of aggression. And I think that we also have to bear something else in mind. I think that we also have to remember that behind a number of the Israeli raids and behind a lot of the action that we've seen over the past few days, there has been the fear that militant groups inside the Gaza Strip are ever more powerful in terms of the weapons that they have available. Let me make an example. Only a few years ago, even the most powerful rockets that were available only had a range of around 25 kilometers. Today, that's changed completely. There are now rockets that are able to be fired towards targets as far as 100 kilometers away. To put that into perspective, that's actually north of Tel Aviv. So there is a far greater fear within the Israeli Defense Forces as to the capability to strike deep inside Israel. Another rather interesting statistic was that with weapons capable of hitting targets at 100-kilometer range, that means that there are roughly 3 to 4 million Israelis at risk. Now, that said, without a shadow of a doubt, the groups that are active in the Gaza Strip today are far more capable of damaging Israel than they were only 2 or 3 years ago. This is very, very interesting. What's also very, very interesting is the fact that these are arms, some of them, as was mentioned earlier on, shoulder-fired missiles, very sophisticated arms, presumably supplied by Iran or fabricated and supplied by Iran, and in all probability mostly coming through tunnels leading between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. So the organizations active within Gaza are ever more powerful and ever more in a position whereby they can strike deep inside Israel. And this is a source of enormous concern for the IDF. And perhaps we can go back to that a little later on in the program.
And Mr. Mark Lowe, how did you first receive the information of the Israeli aggression against Palestinians? Was it something expected if you were following the situation there? And then a war in the region, I mean, in Gaza, would actually extend to the whole region and makes instability even worse there in the Middle East, according to some analysts. Do you share the same view?
I don't know about any increase in instability, because I think that the level of instability would be very, very hard to increase. There is no place on the planet that's more unstable than the Gaza Strip at this moment in time. Mm-hmm. It's also very, very unlikely that any other country would become involved, other than, going back to the concept of financing and arms being supplied by Iran, other than Iran, there are no other countries that would be in any fashion willing to be involved in any form of conflict. Financing comes from private sources in many, many very different countries. But in terms of a state or in terms of a nation, I don't think there ever really has been, and I don't think that there ever really will be, anybody who's prepared to make a firm commitment and join any struggle.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. And Mr. Mutia, how can the results of attack on Nablus be evaluated in general? And what is the lesson learned from this operation for the Palestinians?
Yes, as you know that this aggression and this attack is not the first crime Israel commits against the Palestinian people, and it would never be the last one. Mm-hmm. It's just a part of the long series of the Israeli ongoing attacks against the Palestinian territories. And I think this actually means for the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people understand that it should push the Palestinians more and more towards embracing the only choice they have, the choice of resistance, especially amid the abhorrent silence of the international community and the whole world that stands in silence towards those crimes. Actually, behind every Palestinian killed by the Israeli forces, there is a silent party. The silence of the international community, the whole parties included in this kind of cooperation and communication and ties with the Israeli occupation actually gives the Israeli occupation more and more support to kill more Palestinians. Actually, it's not the responsibility the responsibility only of the Palestinian people to defend themselves. Yes, the Palestinian people understand that they have the responsibility to defend themselves, and they have the legitimate right and the ultimate right to defend themselves. But also there is some kind of important and key responsibility which the international community and the human rights organizations and the profit organizations, NGOs, they have the responsibility, and they need to bear that responsibility. Mm-hmm. They need to stop their investments with the Israeli occupation, and inside the Israeli occupation, they need to cut their ties, to stop funding the Israeli projects, because unless they do that, I think they have the blood of the Palestinian people on their lands, on their hands, actually. Yes. So I think this is expected to push the Palestinians more and more to embrace the choice of resistance here, and to resist more and to insist more and more on having their rights back, actually.
Mm-hmm. And you're raising a very interesting point here, and perhaps Mr. Maklow can answer this question regarding journalism bias when it comes to covering stories on Palestine. We see that the West always turns a blind eye to the atrocities committed by Israel, but then it's not the case when Russia is the aggressor, or Iran or China, for instance, Mr. Maklow.
Well, I don't know that I'm entirely in agreement in the sense that the numbers of deaths over the past few days and the numbers of people injured over the past few days have been very widely reported. At the same time, the logic and the reasoning behind these Israeli attacks in the Gaza Strip have also been widely reported. Another thing that has been widely reported is the fact that, in reality, this is an ongoing crisis that is basically going nowhere, And importantly, organizations such as the United Nations Security Council do nothing other than talk. There is very, very little action. There is very, very little that's positive or of concrete assistance at all. So while on the one hand, we may see far greater reporting on Russian atrocities in Ukraine, for example, or we might find ourselves reading articles or listening to television interviews denouncing the Chinese provocations in the Taiwan Straits, and some very clear, some very interesting reporting coming out of all of this. While we have this on one hand, on the other, perhaps we have less detail coming out of Gaza itself. This is also in part due to some of the difficulties in reporting.
And then Mr. Mutia Misbah also pointed to the fact that the world, perhaps, or the Western community should perhaps apply some sanctions on Israel to stop it or to halt it from making such aggressions and escalating the tense situation, the already tense situation, Mr. Marklow. Mr. Marklow, you with me?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
I said that another point that we could perhaps raise is why the world is not applying any sanctions against Israel for such atrocities. And every single time we find an excuse for Israel as though that it is defending itself, as though the Palestinians do not have the right to defend themselves. That's on the one hand. And on the other is that we see the area or the territory the Palestinians have is shrinking. I mean, look at the difference, the big difference between the borders of 1967, for instance, and now?
Well, one of the reasons for sanctions aren't a particularly efficient option, one of the reasons is the fact that Israel is very, very much autosufficient. Israel grows a lot of its own food. Israel produces a lot of its own technology. Israel has focused over the decades on becoming as independent as is actually possible. So, and this also includes energy, for example, where Israel has placed a lot of effort on becoming independent. So in terms of sanctions, it's very, very difficult to understand what sort of sanctions could be introduced and how hurtful those sanctions may actually be.
Very nice indeed. And Mrs. Hania, since sanctions cannot perhaps be as effective as Mr. Mutia was expecting, perhaps what other alternatives can we do in such crumbling world order? We see that now the US lost control of the world, let's say.
Well, I'd have to disagree with Mr. Marklow on the, let's think of Iran, for example, since he mentioned it earlier. Iran has exactly the same thing. It produces its own power, produces most of the goods and products that are consumed by the country. And yet again, America found a way to propose or enforce sanctions on Iran. The issue is not whether sanctions are applicable, it's whether America is willing to put those sanctions on Israel or not. Because let's face it, the state of complicity and lack of impunity that has been given to Israel is something that is so blatant, so obvious, in the sense that since the start of the aggression on Gaza, that started on Friday, was completely done firsthand, was initiated by Israel itself. And on the other hand, you find countries like America going off on the Israel's right to defend itself. So if you throw the first punch, you can't say that you're defending yourself by doing that. And this is America's narrative of the whole situation. And this war or this aggression on Gaza this time is no change. Once and once again, no matter what happens, all we see is the first thing that comes out of the horse's mouth, out of America, and British and some European countries would be that we support Israel's right to defend itself. It's like an automated response to whatever is happening. We see a state of lack of interest by the international community to hold Israel accountable. If sanctions are not applicable, then organizations like the BDS movement would not be as attacked as they are at the moment, because sanctions do make difference. Not using or not making new companies or not investing in Israel would make big difference. Not using products that have been made in the illegal territories that have been occupied by Israel would make a difference. Labeling those products as they are would make a difference. It would be foolish to assume that that sanctions are implacable. Israel is not bulletproof. It's not bulletproof. It's just supported by the world's greatest country.
Clear.
That's what it is. Because America and the European Union holding a chip on their shoulder since the Holocaust till now, that makes Israel anyone who can stand up against Israel or say or call what it does for what it is, which is a humanitarian, which is a war crime that has been completely enforced on people based on their race because we're Arabs, and doesn't call it what it is. Does not call a spade the way it is, because everyone is afraid of being called anti-Semitic. So might as well Israel goes ahead, kills children, and then America comes out and says Israel has the right to defend itself. It's absurd.
Quite understood.
It's lack of interest in doing anything, not the inability to doing so.
Perhaps I'll give the chance to Mr. Marklow to get back to you on that. Mr. Marklow, don't you see that the occupying entity's approval of the truce is mainly due to serious fears of its inability to control militarily the situation, especially since Hamas was able to transmit terror to the entity in the year 2021 after its missiles managed to penetrate the Iron Dome and accurately hit its targets inside the occupation capital?
Well, okay, first I'll answer your question, thank you. And then I'll go back, because I think there's a very interesting comments were made beforehand. Iron Dome. No, I don't think that there is any fear of a failure in the capabilities of the Iron Dome system at all. I think that the opposite is the problem, that the fear today is that there is an increase in supplies of long-range and short-range weapons to the militant groups that are active inside the Gaza Strip. This has led to a fairly radical change in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, tactics and strategies. Let's remember that generally before any airstrike, local residents are alerted and given the opportunity to leave, to evacuate the zone. During the weekend, this didn't happen. This didn't happen. Now, why? We have to ask ourselves why. One possible answer is, in terms of the specific individuals that Israel wanted and indeed targeted, perhaps it was very difficult to gather intelligence on them, and there was only a very small window of opportunity, and therefore it was either then or wait an awful long time until the opportunity presented itself again. The other consideration is that there is a lot of disaccord inside the Israeli Defense Forces in regards as to what future strategies could be. I think that we all know that within the Israeli Defense Forces there is a fairly strong feeling in regards to a strategy whereby as soon as weapon depots have been identified, or as soon as weapons supplies have actually arrived in the Gaza Strip, then action should be immediate and without warning. And this is very much a U-turn. This is very much a change in strategy. So the fear within Israel just now is the greater number, the greater quantity, the greater quality, and the greater destructive potential of the arms that are arriving in the Gaza Strip. This is Israel's big fear just now, not the fact that our Iron Dome, which gets stronger by the year, is inefficient. That said, if I can go back to a moment to the issue of sanctions.
Go ahead.
The other guest speaker was absolutely correct. At the end of the day, there's no point telling lies or pretending that things work in a different way. When it comes to sanctions, the United States of America is always the leader. And let me be very blunt. Let me say provocatively, if you like, that perhaps Iran didn't have any great lobbying capabilities in Washington. But on a more serious note, the United States of America does not want to become involved in the Middle East in general. It's trying to disengage from the Middle East, a Middle East that's changing radically and very, very quickly as well. The United States of America has interests elsewhere and very, very much views the Palestinian problem as something that Israel will in some fashion manage to resolve alongside its new Arab partners in the region. So the last thing that the Americans want to do is to become involved in the Palestinian question. We're not going to see any support. I'm sorry, but we're not going to see any support at all from the USA.
Yes, and unfortunately, that is the case. Mr. Mutia, officials from the normalizing countries explicitly called for a meeting of the normalizing state and to reconsider the feasibility of this normalization. Is it a sense of responsibility or a warning to the entity that normalization does not mean consent to the Zionist domination in the occupied territories?
Yes, actually, no one can deny that normalization between Arab regimes and the Israeli occupation is a stab in the back of the Palestinian people, and actually it's an obstacle that stands between the Palestinian people and achieving their aims of having the freedom and dignity. Because I think that Israel understands this as a green light to commit more and more crimes and to commit more and more atrocities against the Palestinian people. So the first thing, if those regimes were actually serious with this claim and this regard, the first thing is to stop their normalization and to cut their ties with the Israeli occupation, especially amid this flagrant abuse of Palestinian rights and the flagrant crimes committed and the bloodshedding of the Palestinian children in front of the whole world. So I think I'm very skeptical about this kind of claims that they are serious about their asking for the Israeli occupation, because if they were serious, I think they need to be more serious with the Israelis, with the Israeli side, to oblige the Israeli side or to threaten the Israeli side or to warn the Israeli side just to stop its aggression, to stop its crimes against Palestinians. Otherwise, they will cut their ties or stop their normalization agreements with the Israeli occupation. So this is the situation. I think that the Palestinian people today stand alone in front of the Israeli occupation as the whole Arab regimes abandon the Palestinian people, knowing that the Israeli occupation has no problem with using the fatal and the lethal force against the Palestinian children.
Yes, and Ms. Hania, in a press statement Monday at the United Nations headquarters, the Israeli ambassador to the organization, Gilad Erdan, held the Islamic Jihad movement fully responsible and accused it of using Gazans as human shields. What do you have to say about this?
What do I say about this? I say I don't know, it's like, it sounds a lot like a sick joke in the sense that whenever we think about the coastal aquifer, it is the most heavily populated area in the world. So assuming that people are being used as human shields is basically, I don't know what to call it, honestly. It's just, it's illogical at best. That's one thing. The second thing is that the Israeli technology when it comes to weaponry is very sophisticated, and they can actually target people with a more in a more sophisticated way, and with how to have like much less civilian casualties, but doesn't care about that. And we see that in more than one example in which the civilians and children playing have been targeted. We can look at data from the 2008 war and following ones, where children feeding pigeons, or the children who've been playing at the sea, like little kids who are under the age of 12 have been targeted with no one around, nothing in sight. We have just them and the beach. So it's all like some sort of a justification of the brutal crimes against humanity that have been committed, just to say that there have been, targeting of that sort. And whenever we look at the aggression, has not been started by the Islamic Jihad. It hasn't been started by the Islamic Jihad. It has been started by the Israeli occupation, because as the participant actually said earlier, they had information, they had intelligence, they had data in their disposal that they wanted to get use of. So the whole thing was premeditated or orchestrated in the sense, because no rocket or missile has been sent from Gaza to start to be the first thing that will start the war in Gaza.
Quite understood.
It was just like a pretext. Okay, they were worried because someone came up and they made a verbal, verbal statement. Is that how the war starts? Let's look at the history. That never been the start of the war. It never started. Any aggression on Gaza never started through strongly worded messages. It's been Israeli occupation had data. It had the ability, the chance that they didn't know that we'll have later on of assassinated people they wanted or targeted earlier.
Quite
so
clear.
That's what it
and
is.
Mr. Marklow, just as a final question before we wrap it up, after every barbaric operation against the Gaza Strip, the conversation begins about the reconstruction of Gaza. Who will be responsible for the reconstruction in light of the systematic destruction of the capabilities of the Palestinian people? I mean, is there any possibility that we can perhaps oblige Israel for the reconstruction here?
It's almost like a bad joke to talk in terms of reconstruction. There is no opportunity to reconstruct anything while there is a situation in which there's a danger every second day that something that has been rebuilt or built is destroyed. So, there can be no debate on reconstruction. The only debate right just now has absolutely to be on who will act as an intermediary, who will step in and try and assist some form of
Thank you, Mr. Marklow. Quite clear. The point is clear. Since we run out of time, thank you so much. With this, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude our special coverage. For more info, join our social media platform, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also follow the latest on our website. Bye for now.